All right, well, we're ready to get started. It's lesson 17. I apologize. I'll have questions for you guys for next week. I'm a little behind, but I will catch up. Uh, lesson 17. We're in 2 Kings 22 and 2 Chronicles 34. And so we'll go ahead and start there. If you let's just gonna have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for our day, for the blessings of life, for the word that you've given us that we can study and that we can have a greater understanding of your will for us and for your plan for mankind. Help us as we study these things that we would have a better understanding of what you would have for us to do and who you would have us to be today. Help us to glorify you in our understanding and our praise for you in our in the lives that we live. Please bless us, help us to encourage each other in all we do. We pray in your son's name. Amen. All right. So we're talking about Josiah today. Uh, we last week was kind of depressing. We talked, or 2 weeks ago, I guess, when we talked about Manasseh and Ammon. And today we get back to kind of Judah's last shot, really, or last gasp, if you want to say. Um, Josiah, as we know, as we talked about, I'll do a little bit more timeline stuff next week when we get into the last, kind of the home stretch of the class. But just for today, Josiah, who reigned from 640 to 609, he reigned 31 years. And he was how old when he started reigning? 8 years old. Chances are pretty good he was not making the decisions when he was 8 years old, but he was sitting on the throne and carrying with him the trappings of being king. But it is useful to think about that in terms of Judah and their character, because if you move back in 2 Kings chapter 21, where it tells us the story of Ammon's death, Ammon being Josiah's father, obviously. It says that the servants of Ammon conspired against him and put the king to death in his house. But the people of the land struck down all those who had conspired against King Ammon, and the people of the land made Josiah his son king in his place. So there's a pretty good bet. If you remember, Manasseh, we talked about last week, was known for his idolatry. He brought in just untold levels of depravity and idolatry into Israel. But what happens to him at some point in his life? Yeah. What changes for Manasseh? Why? Second Chronicles tells the story. Okay. All right. Let's back up a little bit more. Why was he in distress? No? There you go. He was taken into captivity. So he's taken into captivity. He entreats the Lord, and after all that he has done, he is brought back. God apparently hears him and forgives him. And we read in the Chronicles account that he goes about making some changes and doing some things. We don't know to the extent to which he did. But when Ammon comes on the scene, we read that he reigned for 2 years, and it says he walked in all the ways in which his father walked. In other words, before he turned back to God. So he basically went back to all the bad things that Manasseh had done. And after 2 years, his servants conspire and kill him. So, and there's an indication maybe from that the people at this point are not so far gone that there was a little bit of a revival under Manasseh, and they don't appear that they're ready to just dive right back into that yet. There's still the idea that we do want to try and serve God, and I suspect that's part of why they deposed Ammon, or at least his servants did. It's the people, of course. It's interesting. The servants kill Ammon. The people punish them because you can't kill the king. But they then put his son Josiah on the throne, of course, because again Josiah is the seed of David. He is the rightful heir, and they're going to keep him on the throne. And the fact that at 8 years, and even early on in his life, I asked the question here: when Josiah began to the process of turning back to God and turning Israel back to God. When did all that really start to begin? Okay. Okay. Um, it says in Second Chronicles 34:3 that he began to seek the Lord in the eighth year, which is 632. He would have been 16 around that time. It says that in the 12th year, in that same chapter, that he began a lot of his reforms. He begins to repair the temple. He begins to start to casting out the idolaters. So right around the time where he gets old enough to where he can start making decisions is the time that we start seeing him seek the Lord. Mhm. Yeah. Yep. Which would be, well, the 18th would that'd be 26. Yeah, that'd be 26. The 18th year of King Josiah, which would be from 8 years old to 26. Okay. So, and what's happening there? No, it's okay. It's all right. Um, it's all right. Yeah, yeah. Um, so where was I? Begins his work. No, you're fine. It's okay. It's all right. Um, during that time, this is what I was looking for. It's 627, which is right around that same time we read in Jeremiah 1 verse 2 that that is the year that Jeremiah was called by the Lord. And so, and there's some discussion about what that means because some people have said that means that Jeremiah was, however old, that's when he began to prophesy, which means he would have prophesied right around the time or started to prophesy right around the time when Josiah became of age and started to make some of his reforms, which may very well be possible. Some people have argued that when it talks about Jeremiah being called by the Lord, it's actually referring to when Jeremiah was born, because if you remember in Jeremiah chapter 1, I didn't ask you to like command you to do the readings or anything from Jeremiah, but if you remember Jeremiah 1, when was Jeremiah appointed as a prophet? At what point did God say Jeremiah is going to be a prophet? Do you remember? That's right. Well, you're almost there. Look over in Jeremiah chapter 1 real quick. Hmm. Yeah, that's the year. Well, that's the year when the last time when that's when his reign as a prophet comes to an end, right? So if you scroll down in verse 4, look what it says in verse 4. Scroll down. Fine. Turn in your page or look down on your page to verse 4 when it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nation." So some people will argue, well, it's possible that this is when Jeremiah was actually born, because what's going to happen is you read Jeremiah, and if you get a chance to read it, I would definitely recommend some of this, particularly as we uh, some of the Jeremiah passages that we're going to read along with Second Kings and Second Chronicles. Um, he's going to talk about Israel in a manner that makes it sound as if Israel came back to God, but not really. And you could apply that either to the time under Manasseh when they came back, or the time when Josiah is going to call them back. In fact, let me scroll down. Scroll down. You can turn, but let's see if I can find it because it's relatively early on. Let's see if I can find it real quick. It's in Jeremiah. Uh, go down to verse 21 of chapter 2 in Jeremiah. There's a couple of things that he says. God's talking through Jeremiah to the people. And he says, "Yet I planted you a choice vine, holy of pure seed. How then have you turned degenerate and become a wild vine? Though you wash yourself with lye and use much soap, the stain of your guilt is still before me, declares the Lord God. How can you say, I'm not unclean? I have not gone after the Baals. Look at your way in the valley. Know what you have done, a restless young camel running here and there." And he goes on and talks about that idea that you're saying that you haven't done any of these things. And it strikes me that this is the it sounds as if he's arguing that Israel's trying to claim that we're not doing any of those things. We're holy, we're devoted to God. We're doing the right things, and Jeremiah's saying, no, you're not. You're claiming that you are. Um, he says down in verse 27 of that same chapter where he says, in fact, let me back up to verse 26. He says, as a thief is shamed when caught, so the house of Israel shall be shamed, they, their kings, their officials, their priests, their prophets, who say to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave me birth. For they have turned their back to me and not their face. But in times of their trouble, they say, arise and save us. But where are your gods that you made for yourself? Let them arise if they can save you in your time of trouble. For as many as your cities are your gods, O Judah. And so, God through Jeremiah letting them know, look, you're talking, you want to be saved. You talk about wanting a relationship, um, but 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 it's not true. It's not fully. You only come back. In fact, I'm trying to remember the passage I'm looking for was when God through Jeremiah says, "You turn back to me, but you turn back in pretense." Uh, yeah, here it is in chapter 3, verse 10, where he's talking about how Israel, the northern tribes, had done all this idolatry. They'd gone off into captivity, and Judah has watched all of this. And rather than taking a lesson from it, they have kind of gone right in that same direction. And it says in verse 9, because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. Yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. And so it may very well be that what Jeremiah is talking about here is what we're going to read today about in the reign of Josiah. That there's going to be a revival of sorts under Josiah, but there's some indications that it might not be a revival that is fully uh, from the heart on behalf of the people. Now, how does Jeremiah described? What does the Bible say about Jeremiah as a king? Jeremiah, Josiah. Sorry, maybe we'll start with Joe. Josiah. How is he described as a king? He's a good king. Yeah. And not just a good king. So it says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the ways of David his father. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. I'm pretty sure. I don't think that phrase to the right or to the left is used to describe anybody since David. In fact, you could probably make an argument that really doesn't even describe David, did it? He turned aside to the right and to the left a couple of different times. But Josiah is described as being upright. It says down in chapter 23, verse 25, it says, before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart, all his soul, all his might. By the way, what does that phrase remind you of? Where have we heard that before? I believe it's Deuteronomy 5 or 6. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, Jesus adds the strength, but yeah, but you're right. It's the same language, and I suspect that's not accidentally. This is the idea that he did the law of Moses, but he didn't just do it. He did it as it was intended to be from the heart. So there's no question that Josiah, what he was trying to do, was absolutely genuine. He had a true love for God. It says that in his eighth year he began to seek the Lord. And I do wonder whether if Jeremiah had begun prophesying during that time, that maybe that had something to do with it. Because if you remember, for a long time, it took me a while to stop confusing Joash and Josiah. What was the big difference? Joash was a big reformer too, if you remember. But what was the big difference between Joash and Josiah? Do you remember? How'd Joash's kingdom reign end up? If you remember, all right, who was Joash? What was it? Let's go back and do a quick review. Anybody remember who situation that arose when Joash took the throne? What was the who was on the throne before him? Athaliah, right? So, and she had the daughter of Ahaz. Yeah, I can't remember. She's a granddaughter of Ahab. I know that. And so she had basically wiped out all the royal family except for she didn't get Joash. And so in the eighth year, they brought Joash in and extra credits, extra credits if you remember the name of the man who helped Joash take the throne. And now I'm blanking on it. But I can tell you it was the high priest. Is it Jehoiadad? I think it's Jehoiadad. Um, Jehoiada the high priest. And if you remember when we studied Joash, what was the source of Joash's faithfulness? Or who? Yeah, Jehoiada, the priest. It says, in fact, it says, as long as he was alive, Joash was faithful. But after he died, what happened with Joash? He was appealed to by other people. He drifted back away. So there was an influence for good that kind of kept Joash on the right track. So going back to Josiah, the big difference appears to be that we don't read about anybody that did that for Josiah. Now there may very well have been people, but this appears to be something that was not done because somebody kind of took him and steered him and kept him on course. This is something he appears to have gravitated towards serving God, and it drives everything that he does. And and I think what's interesting about this, and I'm going to skip ahead to the end of the story, and we'll like the last question we ask about when Josiah dies. Because notice what he says in 2 Kings 23. Still, the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And I don't think this is, again, accidental that the writer makes this point. There has never been a king like Josiah. He was fantastic. He did everything exactly the way he needed to do it. He was exceptional. He sought God with all his heart. Why didn't why didn't God spare Israel? Mhm. Yeah, yeah. The the king can't save the nation. They had to want it with their hearts. They had to pursue God. Just like the problem was that Josiah pursued the Lord with all his heart, but the people didn't. At least a large percentage of the people did not. As a result of that, and I think seems to me to be one of the emphases in the book of Kings, that from the best king to the worst king. How did Ahab die? Remember the story of Ahab when he died? This again, we're going back, but let's refresh our memories a little bit. Remember the story that surrounded Ahab and his death. He and Jehoshaphat are gathered, decide to go up and fight. Uh, and and remember, he says, "Oh, we'll be fine." He gets all the prophets together, and they tell him, "It's you're going to do great. God has promised that you're going to win." And Jehoshaphat's response is what? You know what Jehoshaphat asks? He sees all these prophets fawning over Ahab, an evil king, telling him how great he's going to do. Well, they do, but what does Jehoshaphat ask at this point? After he's heard all these prophets saying, "Hey, you're going to do great." He asks, "Is there not a prophet of the Lord? Is there not a prophet of the Lord that we can hear from?" So they call him Micaiah, right? And Micaiah, of course, the the original sarcastic Jew says, "Oh, go, it'll be fine." And of course, we find out that he's being sarcastic. What he actually means is, no, you're going to be destroyed. Israel's going to be scattered. You're going to die. So Ahab goes into battle anyway. And what is his strategy? How's he going to escape this? How's he going to escape God's judgment? Yeah, he's going to disguise himself, right? He's going to dress as a soldier. And what happens as a result of that? Yeah, just random arrow gets shot out, catches him. He turns around, tells his charioteers, "Take me back. I'm dying," and he goes back and dies in the city. Now, How does Josiah die in battle? What happens to him? He was shot. I'll give you a hint. Exactly what we said happened to Ahab. Yeah, yeah. Ne- with Necho, the king of Egypt, the king of Egypt. Yeah, 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 yeah. And we'll come back to that in a second because that's an important point. But you notice what happens the account that we just read with Ahab and what happens with Joash or Josiah is exactly the same thing. Well, not exactly, but he's told by someone who, by the way, if you remember, Necho actually claims, "God told me to do this. You're fighting against God. You really should back up." And he says, "No, I'll do it anyway, and I'm going to disguise myself." He gets shot by a random arrow. has his charioteers take him back to the city and he dies. It's the exact same story as what we read with Ahab. Is there an implication there? The best king and the worst king, and they died the exact same way. The best king and the worst king, and the nation still is going to be taken into captivity. Yeah. The, yeah. And I don't think that's an accident because they're trying to drive a point home here. And I think I think I've said this before, but if we get nothing else out of the study of the Kings, it's the king cannot save the nation. It doesn't matter. He can be the worst, most corrupt king. He can be the best, most upright king. But at the end of the day, if the kingdom is unrighteous and the people are idolatrous, it doesn't matter. And I think that's kind of the point here that for all of Josiah's righteousness, at the end of the day, he got killed because he didn't do something, he did something beyond what God had called him to do. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. 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 Well, and that's the thing. Yeah, these kings that you've got are all going to die at some point. They're all going to fall short. They can't. They don't have the power to deliver you. Who has the power to deliver you? God does. Yeah, God can do it if you'll repent, if you'll turn back. And so, as a result of that, let's go back to Holly's point real quick. He's going out to fight Pharaoh Necho. Necho's just kind of minding his own business. Well, not minding his own business. He's going up to fight with the Babylonians. They're going up to a place very far up north. I'll show you the map here in a minute. And Josiah hears about this huge army from Egypt coming up north. Uh, and if you're Josiah, that should probably worry you anyway. I mean, just you're going to have this massive army coming into you're always going to be concerned. There's no indication in any of this that Josiah ever inquired of God to say, God, what should I do on this? But as a result of that, he doesn't do it. This, by the way, we took this at Megiddo, the city. I posted this because I don't really have any good shots of the find because it's just so big. It's a sprawling area, but you get the idea here. It's up on the top of a hill. You've got the giant gate which you would come up to, and you got this wide space, including I think that's the palace right there. I just want to show you a little bit here. This is what they would do. This points down. You can't see it real, but this points down from the hill to the valley below. And this circle here is a high place. It's an altar. And what they would typically do is they would take and build an altar in a place where you'd have this great dramatic view over the valley. And so they found this, and it was probably around this time. So during that time, this is what Israel was involved in doing. They were still involved in idolatry. By the way, I just put this in so you'd see it. This is the reservoir. This is where the cistern, the water, this would be filled up with water. Normally, it's inside the city walls at the top of the hill. And what they would do that way is if it's kind of like we talked about with Hezekiah, if the army came around to put them under siege, they still had plenty of water. This tunnel would go down, goes all the way down. As you can see, there's no like you can't get back up here. The only thing you could do is draw water from this. But if I'm an enemy, I can't get into the city this way. And so it leads out to where our exhausted tour guide is climbing the steps to get out outside the city at the bottom of the hill. I can't remember the elevation. It's something like 800 or 900 feet down or something like that. Um, yeah, this and it's way up in the north, and that brings up something I want to come back to that in a little bit. So don't let me forget to talk about that. But Megiddo, that's another picture of it. Here's where Megiddo is, and here's where Jerusalem is. Now, this is where Egypt came up in March. If you'll notice, there's no hills there. This is basically the highway that connected Egypt and Africa and those lands to if it's Greece over here or Babylon up here or Syria over here. This is basically how you would go. And so there's this valley here, which is the Jezreel Valley. We talked about it before, and Megiddo is right here. And the reason that Megiddo is famous and why there were so many people at that site, much more than at any other ones that we were there, what does the word Megiddo sound like? What does that remind you of? What other biblical term? Armageddon, right? That's what it's referring to. This valley, the valley of Armageddon, is this valley right here. If you'll notice, it's huge. And the reason it's so well known, and the reason why Revelation uses that name to depict this battle, is because I forget. There's been more battles fought in this valley than any other location in human history. It's just a wide, flat area, and it connects a number of different nations that are all trying to go and conquer each other. And this is where they ended up meeting. And so when Josiah sees the Egyptian army coming up here and filling this valley, he clearly thinks, look, they're obviously coming for me, and so he goes out to meet them, and he's going to be killed. The Just so you'll know, this is where they were going. There's a if if you've ever heard of the name Carchemish, there's a great battle that was fought between the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and it's going to take place a few years after this, where Babylon defeats Egypt, and basically Egypt's power in that region is going to be broken. Megiddo is way down here. Carchemish is way up there, and Pharaoh Necho was planning to go up here, go all the way up the highway, and meet the Assyrians up in Haran, which is right there, and they were planning there to kind of join forces and fight against Babylon. And so what happens is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. Um, he comes up to Megiddo, he kills Josiah, and as a result of that, Josiah's son Jehoahaz is going to be put on the throne. When Necho goes up here and loses this battle, he comes back to kind of shore things up, and on the way back, he takes Jehoahaz, takes him off the throne, and puts Jehoiakim on the throne. So basically, Jehoiakim is going to be a vassal king of Egypt, and that's going to happen here very shortly. And all of it really is kind of an indirect result of Josiah's mistake and Josiah's unwillingness to be fully humble in this moment. Um, by the way, Haran, does anybody remember? Haran should sound familiar. Does anybody remember that? Where we heard that from? And this is going way back. Yeah, Abraham. Uh, this is where, yeah, Abraham was originally from Ur of the Chaldees, which you can't really see it. It would have been down here in Saudi Arabia. But if you remember, they left that area and they stopped and settled in Haran. That's where God came to Abraham and said, get you out to a nation that I will show you. So it all kind of comes full circle. Yeah. Yeah, something like that. I don't know how long it would have taken. Of course, the army takes a lot longer to go, but yeah, it's an incredibly small area. And I think I've mentioned this before, but this part of history, one of the things that's happening in the Minor Prophets and in the Divided Kingdom story, is that Israel is starting to be taught that the world is much bigger than they are. They are essentially a speed bump on the road between Greece, Babylon, and Egypt, and that's how they're going to be treated for the next hundreds of years, basically. So Josiah's not ready for that. Josiah still wants to be in power, and is unwilling to simply accept Egypt's word. He says, "No, this is my nation. I'm not going to allow you into it." And why might he have thought that it would be okay to go out and fight against Egypt? What does God promise his people? What did God say he would always do for his people if they would follow him? He would fight for them. God will fight our victories. God will take care of us. There's no way that God will allow me to lose to this pagan army, except when I trust in myself or when I trust in God to do something that God has not promised me. And that to me is, I asked the question at the end, what do we learn from Josiah's death? And one of them is that kings can't fix countries. Two of them. The second is that I can't hold God to promises that God doesn't make. Just because God loves me and God cares for me and God has promised to bless me, that does not mean that I can then kind of turn God into my own personal servant that will win whatever battle I choose to fight. Because there's some battles that we're not supposed to we're supposed to go into, and which is exactly what Josiah does. Having said that, Josiah, despite his death, he is described as, behind David, probably the second greatest king in Israel's history. So, as a result of that, let's talk a little bit more about. We'll jump back a little bit and talk about something that Holly pointed out earlier, which is that, well, you pointed out actually, is that this Megiddo is way up here in the northern, what used to be the northern kingdom, right? And if you remember Jerusalem, which was the capital, if you remember way back when we started this and we kind of had the map up that drew up the lines, the divider between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom was probably around here somewhere. So what's happened now is that Josiah, during the course of all of his success, and during this time when apparently the Assyrian Empire is starting to fall apart a little bit, and the Babylonians are starting to insert themselves, and there's a lot of things that are going on, Josiah is able to take it upon himself to go back and take a lot of the land that they had lost. So for the first time in a long time, you have Judah, but you have Judah extending up into kind of the same areas that it was supposed that it had inhabited, back when it was a full United Kingdom. And I think that reflects in something else that happens because when Josiah is going through the process of reforming the nation, what's the big there's two things that he does really that are noted in Kings and Chronicles. The first one we've already talked about. He drives out the idols. He and he's going to restore the temple. In fact, well, I'll go back to that a little bit later. The second thing is that where's it gone? The second thing was that he reestablishes what feast? What feast? Which feast did he reestablish? Do you remember? Passover. Uh, and he describes, if you remember, when it's described in, I think it's Second Kings, when it talks about, well, both books talk about the Passover and how it was kept. Go down in Second Kings chapter 23, down to verse 21. Second Kings 23, verse 21. Now, this is again, and I guess I'm working my way backwards a little bit because I want to make sure that I get to some of these things. It says, the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. For no such Passover has been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or of the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. That's one of those things that, and I wonder about this as well. There's some discussion about what this means, but the indication seems to be that had Israel been celebrating the Passover? We know they did when Hezekiah did it, so we know they were celebrating it, but we don't know, we don't really read a lot about the Passover other than that. And you even think about it makes you wonder, even going back to the days of Saul and David, how diligent were they about celebrating the Passover? They may very well have been, they may have celebrated it, but you get the impression that when Josiah is doing it here, he in the Second Chronicles account, I think is more specific about it because he gets into the role of the priests. He talks about the worship that's involved, and he talks about the detail that they go into after they have found the law. If you remember, they're cleaning out the temple, they're renovating the temple. They find the law, which apparently had been misplaced at some point, probably because you know uh, Manasseh never thought to go back and get it when he did his reforms, and Ammon didn't care about it. And it's apparently been, we know Hezekiah kept the law, but since then, apparently it's just been lost to the point where they find this book. It says in verse 15 of Second Chronicles 34, Hilkiah answered and said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. It says he gave it to Shaphan. Shaphan brought the book to the king, and he brings it to the king and tells him, this is what we found. And so when they read that, what's Josiah's reaction to reading this book? Yeah, he tore his clothes. I can't, and you can imagine because if we were talking about this before class. It's most people believe that probably what they found was the book of Deuteronomy. And if you read Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is very, very clear about what God will do for you if you keep this law, and what God will do to you if you don't keep the law. And Jeremiah, I keep saying that. Josiah's reading this, and he's saying, no wonder we're having troubles. No wonder Israel just got taken into captivity. No wonder that all these nations are surrounding us and attacking us, and why we're basically being reduced to what we are now. Because look at what we've been doing. Look at what we've been ignoring all this time. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. She basically says this is what's going to happen. And by the way, it's interesting when you read what Huldah says. Um, we talked about this before. I think it was Zechariah or Zephaniah, or Zechariah, I think, where he talked about how he's calling the nation back to repent, saying, even now, if you'll come back, maybe you will be spared. There's no talk about sparing anymore. When you read in Jeremiah, when we read what Huldah says here, she says, this is going to happen. Behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants. All the curses that are written in the book that was read before the king of Judah, because they have forsaken me and have made offerings to other gods that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore, my wrath will be poured out on this place and will not be quenched. In other words, this is going to happen. And it goes back to kind of what we were talking about, that it's it's not because God is saying, look, I know you want to repent. I know the nations turn back to me, but it's too late. What he's saying is, you've done too much and you're not going to go back. And as a result of that, you're going to receive these curses. But she says, as we talked about earlier, to Jeremiah, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before God when you heard the words against this place and its inhabitants, and you have humbled yourself before me and have torn your clothes and wept before me. I also have heard you. Behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring upon this place and its inhabitants. By the way, that makes me think about something. Did Josiah get gathered to his fathers in peace? It's it's kind of a relative term. I mean, if you want to argue that this is saying that he didn't have to see Jerusalem destroyed, then that's true. But getting shot in the arm, shot in the chest, and dying from a wound in war is not dying in peace. And I suspect what we're seeing here is that God is telling you, look, I'm going to take care of you because you've humbled yourself. But when Josiah decides to go jump into the shark pit and swim around where he's not supposed to be, the response is, I promised you safety, but you weren't willing to do what I told you to do. And that seems to be what's going on. But regardless of that, she says, look, you will be spared because you have been humble, you have humbled yourself, but the nation's not going to be spared at this point. So so the king's doing this, and I think this is kind of interesting. And I thought about this a little bit. This is another there's so many lessons that I get out of Josiah. The question that jumps out to me more and more as I read this is it really worth it to try to reform something that's dead? Josiah is going to go through a whole lot of work to cleanse out. He gets rid of the high places. He gets rid of the altars. He fixes the temple. He tells the priests, go ahead and take the Ark of the Covenant back into the sanctuary. You don't have to carry it around anymore. In other words, we're apparently some people believe that either Manasseh or Ammon had taken the ark out of the temple because they wanted that room for something else, for idolatrous purposes. Josiah says, bring it back in. He goes through all of this and changes so many things, and yet he knows, because God has told him, that it's not going to matter. And yeah, well, and that's the question. Yeah, it's why go through all this if it's not going to help? And the answer is, well, maybe it did help. Maybe it didn't help the nation, but maybe the reason that Daniel is faithful in the land of Babylon is because, at least for a while, Josiah got the nation pointed back in the right direction. Yeah, yeah. The idea is that there's still hope. There's still good that can be done, and sometimes, frankly, you do it just because it's the right thing to do. The idea that Josiah's not going well. It's not, everything's just going to get undone after I died anyway. So what's the point? Well, no, I'm going to do it because it's the right thing. Yeah, because it's pleasing to God, because that was the heart that he had. And so it's one of the it is kind of a sad story in that he makes all this progress, and it's in this basically almost immediately after he dies, it's all going to go right back where it was before, which is going to be kind of be the beginning of the end. And you'll see, we'll talk about this next week, that Judah just spirals downhill after this point. And it's very easy for us, I think, to kind of put ourselves in that position and get discouraged when we think about, why are we even bothering to talk to people about God? Why do we even talk to people about immorality, and talk about the, the the authority of scriptures and all the things, and trying to serve God with our whole hearts and things like that, when we know they're not going to listen, or chances are pretty good that person who emotionally responded to the I haven't baptized very many people. I baptized 3 people, 4 people maybe in Las Vegas when I was there. Well, no, none of them, none of them are faithful today that I know of. 2 of them never showed up again to church. They got baptized and they disappeared. One of them, I just learned, is one of the Barajas nieces, is no longer faithful. So it'd be easy to say, well, they're not. It's not going to stick anyway. But the idea is, we do those things, we fight those battles, and we don't let ourselves get discouraged. And I think that's kind of what Josiah tries to do, and why he's able to do all of these things. Um, any thoughts or comments on what we talked about so far? Mark, go ahead.
Well, you talk about Isaac,
Yeah.
both 17 and Chronicles gives you the idea that it had not been celebrated
Hmm.
as Josiah had celebrated
Hmm.
since the days of Samuel.
Yeah.
So apparently the kings, maybe all of them, maybe not,
Yeah.
had the feast, but it wasn't in a way that was prescribed.
Yeah.
Wasn't it wasn't a big deal to them.
Yeah. And there's some different ideas about what that means. And part of it, I think a lot of it probably does come back to what you're saying, is that, look, they did it, but it wasn't the rallying cry that Josiah made it to be. If you notice, by the way, in this account, uh, he's got people from the northern tribes coming in. Hezekiah tried to do that. You remember, he sent notes, and they all said, "No, leave us alone. We're not doing that." A few of them did, but this really, and this may be another thing that really, you have to go a long way back to even find a time when the 12 tribes of Israel were united together celebrating the Passover in Jerusalem. And maybe that's part of what it's referring to. The idea that, look, just for this brief moment, we're basically occupying all the land that God gave us, and we're all celebrating the Passover together, and we've gotten rid of the idols, and we're doing what God wants us to do, and maybe that's part of it too. So, but again, it's temporary, and it falls apart very quickly. But yeah, any other thoughts, comments, Stephen?
Yeah. The Assyrians at the Battle of they
Yeah, yeah.
take
Yeah, they're 2 empires. Well, I don't know if it's their only purpose, but that's how God uses them. You had the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians have been uh, around for centuries before this, and they'd been a big power. Then they kind of shrunk, and then they became a bigger power again. And God brings them down, and they take over this whole region, including the 10 tribes of Israel, and they have control over Judah as well. So what's now going to happen during this time when Josiah is now king is right around the time the Assyrians are starting to lose control of this. We got Egypt fighting them, you got Babylon fighting them, and we're not really worried about Israel anymore. And all of a sudden, Josiah is able to build some things back up. Well, what's going to happen is, after Josiah's gone, around the time that Babylon takes control of everything, and God's going to bring the Babylonians down, and they are going to be the ones that will finally are going to destroy Jerusalem during that time. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, particularly what Jeremiah says about them, and the relationships that we have. 3 different groups of people are going to be taken into Babylonian captivity in the next uh, 50 years or so. something like that.
well, well, it's
Yeah.
flat out great, here in the people.
Well, and what's interesting about it, you hear about this. I won't get too far into it because I know you got the invitation, but Babylon's kind of interesting because they kind of came on the scene very very quickly, and they got defeated very very quickly, and it very much looks from a historical standpoint like this is a nation that God raised up and made powerful for one purpose, and that was to destroy Jerusalem and to take this region. Because almost within 70 years of that, which is when God said, "I'm going to bring you back from captivity," the Medes and the Persians have created a force, and they go in and take Babylon, and Jerusalem is sent back, and Babylon's never heard from again, not as a power. Um, so,
Very wrong.
same thing with Rome. Rome is raised up. Now Rome was around a lot longer, and they stayed around a lot longer, but especially it's interesting, and we could talk about this in the book of Daniel, the idea that God uses each of these nations, each of these empires in it that have these unique qualities and characters to bring into place a situation that would enable the gospel to take place. You know, you've got the Assyrian the you got the Assyrians, the Babylonians who scattered the Jews throughout the known world essentially. So that by the time you get to the point of the time of Christ, you've got Jews that are in Africa, you've got Jews that are in Greece and Rome and all around the known world, all of whom have become a prime field to go preach the gospel to. You've got the Greeks who create a common language and have everybody united in a common culture. They bring reason and logic into the so now we can talk about things. The gospel is a very logical and reasoned argument, and the Greeks make that possible. You get the Romans who make the roads that make travel possible, and commerce and things of that nature. So all these things just kind of fall together, not fall together. God brings them together so that when Jesus comes, it's ready. When the fullness of time has come, everything is in place. Um, all we have to do is bring him into the world, and it's ready. So yeah, God uses those empires according to however He wants, and to whatever purpose He chooses. Lord, you? Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. That renewed the covenant. That specifically talk about trying, and that's when you do that, you're trying to get the people to enter into that covenant as well. And so Josiah, it wasn't for lack of trying that Josiah did this, but at the end of the day, it's you read this in Jeremiah's account. Look, you seem to think that you can straddle the fence and worship God and worship these idols and allow these things to take place in your city, and that God's going to be okay with that. And that's kind of where they seem to be even after Josiah's time. They don't abandon God, but they don't get rid of the other idols and the other influences. So anyway, I'm taking up Dan's time. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll continue on next week.